Hello again, this is Mark Mitchell. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 5, which is on power. One of my favorite chapters here in the textbook. There's lots that I like, but I think I like this more than some of the others, so I'm interested in this topic. Our chapter outline tells us where we're going to start, and then we'll finish up by the end of the video today, and of course reading in your textbook. But all about power. So we also have some extra articles there that trying to illustrate some of the key concepts as usual. It's just one of the habits our author has. Most authors have a habit or one way or the other, and this is just for our textbook. So those are usually right on spot articles, and they go with the reading very well. Okay, so we get right into it, but power is really not about physical strength. That's an interesting concept. I know there's an old movie I like, but the definition of power in our book matches up really to what this character said. It was the older version of Conan the Barbarian. But any rate, it's the ability to get an outcome that you desire over someone else. All right, even when you experience opposition. But that's really the definition of power. And then we often read or hear of empowering different groups of people. Our book specifically mentions women, but you could, I think, also include any other minority group. And the reason that you would do is because they usually have lacked some sort of power in the past or the ability to do some things that they wanted to do. So I think that's pretty common examples. All right, but our book mentions if you're going to empower a group of people, and we have a couple other examples in our book where some in the United States and some outside the United States. But there's three keys, and they're listed here to our slide, but it's education, organization, and then networking there. But these would be very important in order to empower a certain group. And really not going to get into it, but at the end of these slides, there's a few individuals named, and one of them is Saul Alinsky, but he wrote a book, and it is very widely followed by many people who are in politics. But it really, for example, some of the principles that he lists there are very similar to what we have. It's just he goes into much more detail. But that book has been around for, I think, 40 to 50 years, and so it's really at least worthwhile to those who would be fans of Saul Alinsky. Okay, but we have different forms of power that are mentioned in our chapter. We're fixing to see a slide that has a lot of different power tactics that are used to influence others. But we see when you do talk about power, you can use it to persuade. That's to convince somebody of your point of view. You can also use power to reward, to get somebody to comply with you. And then if that doesn't work, coercion is a third technique there. And so using force to get somebody to comply. All right, but maybe an example that shows all three is suppose that you had a roommate and you wanted that roommate to be neater. You could use all three of these things. Hopefully the easiest one works first, and that would be persuasion. And maybe you could try to tell them that, hey, if you're neater, then that'll, be better off for you health-wise. Maybe if that doesn't work, you can reward them. Say, hey, if you do clean up, I'll give you $10, or maybe a privilege or something. And then finally, hey, if you don't clean up, then I'm gonna kick you out of the apartment or whatever living arrangement it was. Okay, but those are some, and it may remind you of some psychology that you've had before. I think you could easily relate it to that. Some of those techniques that we mentioned in that slide. What type of power techniques do organizations and groups use? Well, here we just have a couple researchers, and you can see some of them listed there. But they wouldn't be all that different from what we mentioned from the previous slide. It's just there's a few different examples that are listed there. All right, and if you're following along in the textbook, that's pages 103 to 104. Now, when it comes to outside organizations, we see power in everyday life. And again, some of these other slides may apply to that. But people have different techniques depending on which works better for them. But the hard and soft tactics, these are, for example, when you use some sort of economic threat or something like that, that would be the hard method. The soft would be something that really doesn't use threat but collaboration and friendship, again, to get somebody to agree to what you want them to. Rational and non-rational, they make pretty much sense by their names alone, but rational appeals to logic, and non-rational, for example, appeals to emotions or affective type outcomes that way. All right, unilateral and bilateral, for example, if you had a military conflict, if one side bombs the other, that's unilateral. It's only coming from one side. The opposing enemy did not agree to be bombed, but that's what the other enemy decided to do. Bilateral means it comes from both sides, right? So maybe a negotiation for buying a car or something like that. That would be a good example there. Here's the chart that lists just a whole lot of different ways to influence others in everyday situations. We've got another chart with some more, but there are some interesting ways, and I'm sure you can either experience many of these or seen them on television or commercial. It's a large table in our book, Table 5.1, but I'll have 2 PowerPoint slides here. Some of these we've mentioned, but we won't take the time to mention the rest. You can read through those if they seem interesting to you. Okay, but we moving on to a different topic. We have a short article there before this begins on Michel Foucault, but he really wrote a book, and it was about punishment, and it really influenced a lot of people over a long period of time about what type of punishment for criminals actually worked versus the types that didn't work. And actually, the less severe punishment types seemed to work better than those that were more severe. Okay, but back to this, our book focuses on 3 different uses of power. Economic, I think a lot of uses of power are that, because we're in a lot of cases fined for things that government, either on a local, state, or federal level, is trying to prevent us from doing. Political power, we're going to look at that, and then cultural power and how reality is defined. Hegemony is listed here, but it's the idea that those who are on top, those who are in power, they basically get to make up the rules and define, for example, what is considered right or what is considered wrong, and if those in power, not in power rather, if they violate it, then they are subject to penalties. We have different types of leaders, and this shows power in relationships. But for example, legitimate power or authority is those who can rightfully say that they wield the power and they should have it, and then others, for example, should obey that because they have it as it should be. Illegitimate power is when you can't make that claim and you take it by force or coercion and get somebody to try to agree with you that way. Different types of leader, not all that different from the different types of power that we just looked at, but you have rational legal authority, for example, someone who would win an election, for example, in our nation. Traditional authority would be maybe a ruler in England, say a king or some type of monarch that way, who says they have a right to rule because they have followed this well-established cultural practice that's been in effect for a long time. Charismatic authority is somebody who's just has these personal characteristics that just make others want to follow them. So we certainly have a lot of examples of charismatic authority. Maybe in religion you could say that, quite a few examples, but on the downside, those people usually don't live very long. They're usually assassinated or murdered. All right, we have another interesting section, but it's still under the power and social relationships. But the role of compliance or conformity, the power of disobedience, and the power of privileges are a few sections that it does talk about. A concept that you'll find in a lot of sociology books is privilege, and that's where some people can claim certain advantages relative to other groups of people. And we'll have some slides to illustrate that. but it's over a wide range of areas. So it could be economic or educational. It's just ever expanding in the area of privilege where there's some type of inequality. And the idea is today is we should not have that. Everybody should have the same amount. So it's really a question of, do you want equal opportunity or equal outcome? And it seems to be maybe more of the equal outcome right now. That's going to be, I think, difficult to achieve. All right, but the standpoint theory is rather maybe something new, but it's really related to this idea of power and privilege. But it really, for example, introduces the idea that we can look at multiple viewpoints. So, for example, what our book does is from social class, race, and gender. And we pick those because those would be people who would have less power or no power. And then, for example, we try to look at it really from their perspective, a lot of these issues. All right, so we have talked a little bit about under the economic conditions, the idea of inequality. So, is it fair that some people make more money than others? It's not hard to see many days where fast food workers or some other class of workers, wants a significant raise. Say $15 an hour. I've heard of that many times where no matter what you do, you should be paid a certain amount of money. That would be fair. The Occupy movement of some years ago suggested something similar, except they wanted everybody everywhere to make $20 an hour, no matter if they went to work or not. Our book also mentions class, so you might think of social class as maybe a first option there, but it's really people who are very similar. And so in the United States, that's our working class or middle class. Hopefully middle class would be more representative because that, I think, would indicate a better economic outcome for people. But I think rather it's going down than up. And then life chances is a Max Weber term that we've seen many chapters now, but he is one who would argue, what would be possible for a person in their life based on their life chances. All right, prestige is also related to esteem, and so sometimes you'll find in sociology books they'll have different type of occupations and how esteemed they are. How people rate them from the scale to 0 to 100. I think that's where our book is actually coming from, but it doesn't have that chart. It just mentions the social status. So, for example, being a doctor, being a lawyer, being a president versus maybe being a beggar or a prostitute. You've got the high range versus the low range. We can also talk about discrimination. I know everyone is familiar with that, but by gender, by race, by age, by social class, you can just go on and on of where people feel they are not being treated fairly, and not just the United States, but worldwide. You can find lots of examples of that. And then finally, social closure may be a new term, but it's the idea, for example, that once you have power, you apply it to your group and you really don't share it with anybody else. That's really kind of what that idea says, is that you keep all the good things for the members that are related to you. Intersectionality theory just says, for example, how race, class, and gender work together in terms of inequality. So again, when we have been looking at power, this seems to be a really big part of the chapter. And of course, there seems to be, so much movement today towards equal rights that it's just really at a fast pace that I am just really amazed that it's going as fast as it is compared to times past. It didn't seem to work nearly as rapid as today. The matrix of domination, again, is not much different from intersectionality theory, really. If you just look, for example, again, what the definition includes, it's looking at how these different social statuses affect people's lives and what they wind up doing. Our book also mentions stratification systems, and when I think of stratification, I think of either geology and the different layers of the earth, except now we're looking at different layers of people from top to bottom, those considered the best and on top versus those that are considered in the middle and lower. And the Titanic is a good example of stratification, the famous boat that sank more than 100 years ago. But if you were a first class ticket holder, you were more likely to survive than the second class, third class, or even worse. But our book has a few things to say about that. But it says with stratification systems, the bottom three bulleted items are in play. But you got unequal distribution of valued resources, so money or salary or things like that. You have distinct groups that make up the layers, and we'll see some examples of that. But these are from different cultures, and you don't have to memorize the names. Just know it goes from top to middle to bottom. And then there's some type of justification for this inequality. Now our book stops a little short there, but really with this statement, what it's saying is even though we have stratification, which divides resources up, it's seen as fair. So every society decides a little differently how this is to proceed. But everywhere throughout world history, they've always had stratification. But you could argue, well, if we didn't pay doctors, a high salary, then who would study 8 years to become a doctor when you could make the same amount of money, say, driving a cab or something like that? So maybe there are some bad points of stratification that we need to eliminate, and then maybe there's some good points to stratification that we need to keep to encourage some people to invest their time and studies and efforts, knowing that one day it's going to pay off for them. All right, but our book gets back to the inequality based on all these areas. I guess economic is number one. Human resources, for example, do or should people have a right to education, where it's paid for, and you just go, for example, instead of paying out of your own pocket. So there's lots of good questions you can ask from this, but really talk about power. All right, the idea there with stratification and social mobility, are there stratification systems where you can move up or down, or are there systems of stratification where once you're born, you're there for life? Well, we have both. It's just the stratification system in the United States is the social class system, and that's one where we do have the ability to move up or down as compared to caste systems. Our book mentions later on a few slides, but you can't move once you're in a caste system, no matter what happens to you. All right, this next slide does bring up that caste system and mentions with India and also the feudal states several hundred years ago, and within the United States, something that approximates that caste system is that of racial segregation. All right, now don't memorize these names, but under India's caste system, from the top to the bottom, they list these hard to pronounce terms that are categorizing people. They do that just to give us an example, but we do the same thing in the United States. It's just we don't have a caste system. It's a social class system, but we still have top to bottom. Now, our book further describes the feudal estate system, and that goes back to the Middle Ages, where the most important economic asset one could have would be land, and that's what the nobility had. They're on top, and then you have the clergy, and then the commoners who basically farmed the land and got to keep a little bit of what they produced, but gave most of it back to the nobility. Now, in the United States, during the time in which we had slavery and then even racial segregation in the United States, that's what our book includes there as another look of something that really does resemble a caste system. Your status there was fixed, and it was really hard to change it until many years later. All right, under class systems, social class systems, it's different from a caste system. You can move up and down based on your wealth, based on your achievement, and other things. And then we also have a little bit of information there of capitalist systems and socialist systems. We could also throw in a third and call it communist systems. And people have to decide which one they like better. I personally like the capitalist system, but Karl Marx would say there's just too much trouble with that. There's too much suffering. There's not enough wealth spread around. So many people go without, and there's just a few lucky ones at the top. And he would rather replace that with a communist system, which in theory says that everybody is the same. But my fear on that would be that everybody would be equally poor, like, say, in North Korea or other places in the world where there's a lot of suffering. I don't want to experience any inequality like that. But again, people can differ. So if you like a socialist system, and I certainly think there's a lot of motivation towards that today, especially for young people who maybe feel like the capitalist system has failed them. I can certainly understand why people would like that. The socialist system, you have more freedom than the communist system, but you have less than the capitalist system, but then you have a safety net to help you when you need it. So if you're sick, you don't have to worry about paying the doctor. If you're unemployed, you get unemployment benefits. You get help with child care. Now, the cost to that is your freedom and your tax money. So that's, the difference. In the capitalist system, it's sink or swim, and that can be scary as well. But that's just a little bit to say. Usually, there'll be other chapters in the book that go into it a little bit more in depth. Patriarchy is a society in which males really dominate more. That seems to be the case most of the world. There are some societies that are where mothers and women, the matriarchy, for example, were female dominated. But that seems to be a whole lot fewer. So can inequality be reduced? And that's a question you ought to ask yourself. I think you can answer it both ways, yes and no. It just depends on how you want to address it. Maybe if you answer it no, the world has always had inequality. And that's because, people emphasize different things. If you did want to reduce inequality, what would you have to do? You'd have to take really some drastic steps to do that. But it is really an interesting question. Do you think we could ever have a utopia here on planet Earth? That would be something that's talked about, but I don't know if that's really possible. Now, the rest of our slides here today, if you're interested in it, I think our author is maybe into politics a little bit, but he's really showing, for example, some information about elections and how it's influenced by really people at the top. And that's not a surprise to anybody. It's people with money. They get the ears of our politicians because they're always trying to raise money for one reason or the other. And that's really, I don't think, part of the system that our forefathers envisioned. A lot of the buildings today, public buildings where elected officials are, they're a whole lot smaller than what they used to be because people used to go to these places and actually debate things. And today, maybe we don't have as much because of what the point our chapter is trying to make about how people are paid off and take money, and they just represent, instead of people, corporate interest or lobbying interest in things of that. Our book does mention some of that. Michel Foucault is mentioned here, but talking about power is everywhere. I think that is a good observation. And some people are very good at trying to maximize the amount of power that they have. I mentioned earlier at the beginning with Karl Marx and Saul Alinsky, but these were very influential guys who had very influential ideas that are still alive today and probably more prevalent than a lot of us actually think. And that ought to tell us something about how useful these ideas were if they're still being used today. I like this chapter because I like the social conflict paradigm, and it really says, who benefits. Things we see in society are not by accident. There's somebody who benefits from it and somebody who doesn't. And I think this chapter kind of ties in with that idea, at least, and that's just kind of what I think of when I read articles and wonder about why things are the way that they actually are. Here's that slide that does mention one of the names. I'm sure everybody remembers Martin Luther King, and maybe not so much Gene Sharp, but other people are familiar based on Sharp's research that, again, our book talks just a little bit about. The last couple slides, you can, again, read in the chapter for yourself, and some of these I think you might find more of an interest to than others. This one's a good one, but I think some of the others got my attention more. And then finally, just the review. We've talked about power, so you should have a really good idea about some of those concepts. And we actually do. I think the second bulletin point is true. We do have more power than you might realize. And at the time of this recording, it hasn't been too long since teachers in North Carolina were basically at the Capitol trying to get their point of view across about raises and funding for schools. And it's no coincidence that they did that, because there's been several other states where teachers have done that, and they actually got raises that, had they not protested and left the classroom for a few days or what have you, then they wouldn't have got those raises. But eventually the state governments yielded to their demands because it was disrupting the social order, the social structure that, hey, kids have got to go to school so parents can go to work. If children have to stay home, then parents have to stay home, and that really can't keep going on for a long time before there starts to be some problems. So that was a gamble on the teacher's part, but it seemed to work out well for them. All right, so we have come to the end of another chapter. Thank you. I hope this has helped, and if I can help you further, please contact me.
That's all, folks.